The sun beat down on the crowded park as the annual Veterans Appreciation Day celebration was in full swing. Red, white, and blue banners fluttered in the warm breeze, and the air was filled with the scent of barbecue and the sound of patriotic music. Families sprawled on picnic blankets, children ran around with miniature flags, and groups of veterans gathered, sharing stories and laughter. Amidst this sea of festivity, Brad Matthews stood alone, nursing a lukewarm beer and fighting the urge to roll his eyes. At 32, he felt completely out of place among the families and older veterans. To him, this whole event seemed like a waste of time and resources. "Why can't we focus on the future instead of dwelling on the past?" he muttered to himself, watching as a group of elderly veterans made their way to the stage. The MC announced that they would be sharing their stories, and Brad scoffed audibly. "Great! More tales from the crypt," he said under his breath, earning a disapproving glare from a nearby mother who quickly ushered her children away. As Brad turned to head towards the beer tent for a refill, he nearly collided with an elderly man. The old-timer wore a pair of scuffed shoes and a faded military cap that had clearly seen better days. "Whoa there, young fella," the man said with a chuckle. "No need to rush. Plenty of time to enjoy the day." Brad forced a tight smile.
"Yeah, sure."
Enjoying reliving the glory days of wars long past. Exactly how I wanted to spend my Saturday. The old man's smile faltered slightly, but he pressed on. "Name's Frank. First time at one of these events."
"Brad."
"And yeah, hopefully the last too," Brad replied, not bothering to hide his disdain. "No offense, but I don't see the point in all this. The world's moved on. We've got real problems to solve, not just old wars to remember." Frank's eyes clouded for a moment, but he nodded politely. "Everyone's entitled to their opinion, I suppose. But you might be surprised at what you could learn here." Brad snorted. "Yeah, I'm sure. Look, no disrespect, but I've got better things to do than listen to stories about ancient history. You guys had your time. Maybe it's time to let the younger generation take over." Without waiting for a response, Brad turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Frank standing alone in the crowd. As he made his way to the beer tent, Brad felt a surge of superiority. He was above all this sentimentality, focused on the future rather than clinging to the past. Little did he know, his encounter with Frank was about to change everything. As the afternoon wore on, Brad found himself gravitating back towards the main stage, drawn by a morbid curiosity. The MC was introducing the next speaker, and Brad's eyebrows shot up in surprise when he recognized the name. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage a true American hero, Mr. Frank Hawkins." Brad watched in disbelief as the old man he dismissed earlier made his way up to the microphone. Frank moved slowly but deliberately, his weathered hands gripping the sides of the podium as he began to speak. "Thank you all for being here today," Frank started, his voice gravelly but strong. "I'm honored to share my story with you." Brad tuned out almost immediately, rolling his eyes dramatically. He edged his way to the back of the crowd, muttering under his breath. "Honored? Please." More like desperate for attention. He scoffed, loud enough for those nearby to hear. A few people shot him disapproving looks, but Brad was oblivious to their reactions. As Frank continued his speech, talking about his time in the service and the bonds he'd formed with his fellow soldiers, Brad's comments grew increasingly disrespectful. "Oh, come on. Who cares about what happened 50 years ago?" he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "We should be celebrating real heroes, like Elon Musk or LeBron James. You know, people actually making a difference today." A woman standing nearby, with her young son, glared at Brad. "Excuse me," she hissed, "but some of us are trying to listen and show respect." Brad shrugged, unrepentant. "Hey, I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. This is all just a big waste of time and money." On stage, Frank faltered for a moment, his eyes flickering towards the commotion at the back of the crowd. But he took a deep breath and continued his story, speaking about the challenges of returning home and adapting to civilian life. Brad's friends, Tom and Sarah, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up. "Dude, seriously?" Tom whispered. "You need to chill. This isn't cool." Sarah nodded in agreement. "Brad, you're being a real jerk right now." These people deserve our respect. But Brad was too far gone, riding high on his own perceived superiority. Respect? For what? Living long enough to tell the same old stories year after year? Give me a break. As Frank's speech drew to a close, met with enthusiastic applause from the crowd, Brad had had enough. He tossed his empty beer cup into a nearby trash can with unnecessary force. Well, that was a complete waste of an afternoon, he announced to no one in particular. I'm out of here. You guys enjoy your little trip down memory lane. With that, Brad turned and strode away from the stage, leaving a wake of uncomfortable silence behind him. He felt vindicated, certain that he was the only one seeing clearly in a sea of misplaced nostalgia. Little did he know his world was about to be turned upside down. Brad wandered aimlessly through the park, his earlier bravado fading into a vague sense of discontent. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the grounds as the event wound down. He found himself near a small gazebo, where a group of people had gathered, speaking in hushed, reverent tones. Curiosity piqued, Brad edged closer, catching snippets of their conversation. Can you believe Frank was there that day? One of the first to rush in? True hero, if you ask me. Brad's brow furrowed in confusion. Were they talking about the same Frank he had mocked earlier? He inched closer, straining to hear more. An older woman in the group was speaking now, her voice filled with emotion. My sister was in the North Tower that day. She told me how Frank and the other first responders kept going back in, even as the building was coming down around them. They saved so many lives. Brad felt his stomach drop. What day? He asked before he could stop himself, drawing the attention of the group. A man in his 40s looked at him incredulously. September 11th, 2001. Frank was one of the first responders at Ground Zero. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as the full weight of this revelation hit Brad. His mind raced back to the elderly man he had so callously dismissed, the man whose stories he had deemed irrelevant. That same man had rushed headlong into one of the greatest tragedies in modern history, risking his life to save others. But he's so old, Brad stammered, his earlier arrogance crumbling. I thought he was just some veteran from, like, Vietnam or something. The group looked at him with a mixture of pity and disdain. Another woman spoke up, her voice gentle but firm. Frank was in his 50s when the towers fell. He had already retired from the fire department, but when he heard what was happening, he didn't hesitate. He put on his old gear and went straight to Ground Zero. Brad's legs felt weak as the stories continued to pour out. Frank had been trapped under rubble for hours, but refused medical treatment once he was freed, insisting on going back to search for survivors. He had saved countless lives that day, pulling people from the wreckage even as the air filled with toxic dust and debris. The memories of his own cruel words came flooding back, each one now a dagger of shame piercing his heart. He had mocked this man, dismissed his bravery as irrelevant history, all while being completely ignorant of the true depth of his heroism. As the group continued to talk, sharing stories of Frank's bravery and the impact he had made, Brad stood frozen in place. The enormity of his mistake, the sheer scale of his disrespect, crashed over him in waves. He had judged a book by its cover in the worst possible way, and now he was faced with the uncomfortable truth of his own ignorance and prejudice. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the park in twilight, but Brad barely noticed. He was lost in thought, grappling with the realization that the history he had so casually dismissed was far more recent and relevant than he had ever imagined. And the man he had written off as a relic of the past was, in fact, a living embodiment of courage and selflessness. As the group dispersed, Brad remained rooted to the spot, overwhelmed by guilt and shame. He knew he had to make this right somehow, but the path forward seemed daunting and unclear. One thing was certain: his perspective had been irrevocably changed, and he would never again make the mistake of underestimating the quiet heroes walking among us. The revelation about Frank's heroic past had left Brad reeling. As the evening progressed and the event began to wind down, he found himself unable to leave, instead lingering on the outskirts of the gathering, his eyes fixed on the elderly veteran he had so callously dismissed earlier. Frank was now surrounded by a small group of people, each waiting patiently for their turn to shake his hand or share a word of gratitude. Brad watched as Frank greeted each person with warmth and humility, his weathered face creasing into a gentle smile as he listened to their stories and thanks. A lump formed in Brad's throat as he remembered his own words from earlier in the day. Ancient history, he had called it, irrelevant. Now, seeing the impact Frank had on these people, the respect and admiration in their eyes, Brad felt a wave of shame wash over him. He thought back to the stories he had overheard of Frank rushing into the burning towers on September 11th, risking his life to save others. Brad tried to imagine himself in that situation. The chaos, the fear, the overwhelming urge to run away instead of towards danger. Would he have had the courage to do what Frank did? The answer, he realized with a sinking feeling, was probably not. As he continued to observe, Brad noticed the small details he had overlooked before. The way Frank's hands shook slightly as he reached out to greet people, likely a remnant of the trauma he had endured. The deep lines etched into his face, telling a story of hardship and resilience. The quiet dignity with which he carried himself, never boasting or seeking attention, but simply being present for those who needed him. Brad's mind raced, trying to reconcile the man he saw now with the dismissive caricature he had created in his head earlier. How could he have been so blind, so quick to judge based on nothing more than age and appearance? He had prided himself on being forward-thinking, on valuing innovation and progress above all else. But now he realized that in his rush to embrace the future, he had arrogantly dismissed the very foundations upon which that future was built. The weight of his ignorance pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. He had not only disrespected Frank, but had also dishonored the memory of all those who had sacrificed so much on that terrible day in September. His flippant comments now seemed not just rude, but almost sacrilegious in the face of such profound bravery and loss. As the crowd around Frank began to thin, Brad felt an overwhelming urge to approach him, to apologize for his behavior. But fear held him back. What could he possibly say to make up for his cruel words? How could he explain that he had judged an entire generation based on nothing more than his own biased assumptions? The sun had long since set, and the park was now illuminated by strings of soft lights. In this gentle glow, Frank looked both fragile and indomitable, a living testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Brad realized that he had been given a precious gift today, the chance to learn, to grow, to challenge his own preconceptions. He knew that whatever happened next, he would carry this lesson with him for the rest of his life. Taking a deep breath, Brad steeled himself for what he knew he had to do. It wouldn't be easy, and it certainly wouldn't erase the hurt he had caused. But it was a necessary first step on the path to becoming a better, more compassionate person. With trembling legs, he began to make his way towards Frank, ready to face the consequences of his actions and, hopefully, to begin to make amends. Brad's heart pounded in his chest as he approached Frank, who was now sitting alone at a small table, quietly observing the few remaining attendees of the event. The elderly veteran's eyes, though tired, still held a spark of warmth as they met Brad's nervous gaze. "Excuse me, sir," Brad began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Hawkins."
"Frank, I
owe you an apology." Frank looked up at him, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. He gestured to the empty chair across from him, inviting Brad to sit. Brad lowered himself into the seat, his hands shaking slightly as he clasped them on the table. I said some terrible things earlier," Brad continued, struggling to maintain eye contact. "I was ignorant and disrespectful, and I had no idea at all about your past, about what you've done." Frank remained silent, his expression unreadable as he listened to Brad's halting words. "I heard about what you did on September 11th, Brad pressed on, the words tumbling out now. "How you rushed into those buildings, how you saved all those people. I can't even imagine the courage that must have taken. And I mocked you. I called your experiences irrelevant, ancient history. I was so wrong, so incredibly wrong." Brad's voice broke, and he had to take a moment to compose himself before continuing. I've learned a hard lesson today about judging people based on appearances, about the danger of dismissing the experiences of others just because they're different from me. I understand now the importance of recognizing the sacrifices made by people like you veterans, first responders, true heroes. Frank's silence stretched on, and Brad felt the full weight of his actions pressing down on him. When Frank finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "You know, son, I've heard worse in my time," he said, a hint of a sad smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "But I appreciate you coming to talk to me. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong." Brad felt a glimmer of hope at these words, but Frank wasn't finished. What he said earlier, it hurt. Not just me, but everyone who's ever put on a uniform, everyone who's ever run towards danger instead of away from it. We don't do what we do for recognition or glory. We do it because it's right, because someone has to. Frank leaned forward, his eyes boring into Brad's. "The world moves fast, I know that. But history isn't just something you read in books or see in movies. It's alive in the people around you, in the consequences of actions taken long ago. Forgetting that, dismissing that, it's a dangerous thing." Brad nodded, feeling the truth of Frank's words deep in his bones. "I understand that now," he said softly. "And I promise you, I'll never make that mistake again. I'll do better, be better." Frank studied him for a long moment, then slowly extended his hand across the table. "That's all any of us can do, son. Learn, grow, and try to leave the world a little better than we found it." Brad grasped Frank's hand, feeling the strength still present in the old veteran's grip. As they shook hands, Brad felt something shift inside him. A newfound respect not just for Frank, but for all those whose quiet sacrifices shaped the world he lived in. As they parted, Frank left Brad with one last piece of wisdom. "Remember, young man, every person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Be kind, always." Brad watched as Frank walked away, his stooped figure somehow seeming taller and stronger than before. In that moment, Brad vowed to himself that he would carry this lesson with him always, a constant reminder of the dangers of judgment and the power of humility and respect. As the last remnants of the Veterans Appreciation Day event were being cleared away, Brad found himself lingering in the park, his mind awash with the day's events. The once bustling grounds were now quiet, save for the distant sound of cleanup crews and the gentle rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. Brad's encounter with Frank had profoundly shaken him, forcing him to confront his own prejudices and misconceptions. As he wandered through the park, he found himself drawn to the various memorials and displays that he had earlier dismissed as irrelevant. Now, he approached each one with a newfound sense of reverence and curiosity. At a wall displaying photographs of local veterans, Brad paused, really looking at the faces for the first time. Young men and women in uniform stared back at him, their eyes full of determination and hope. He realized that each of these individuals had a story, a life shaped by their experiences of service and sacrifice. "Quite something, isn't it?" a voice said beside him. Brad turned to see an older woman gazing at the photos, her eyes misty with emotion. "It is," Brad agreed softly. I never really thought about it before, about what it all means." The woman nodded. "My husband's up there," she said, pointing to a faded photograph of a young Marine. "He didn't make it home. But knowing that people still remember, still care, it means everything." Brad felt a lump form in his throat. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, the words feeling inadequate but heartfelt. "And thank you for your family's sacrifice." As he continued through the park, Brad found himself engaging with other attendees, listening to their stories with genuine interest. He spoke with a young veteran who had served in Afghanistan, learning about the challenges of reintegrating into civilian life. He chatted with a group of children who were creating thank you cards for deployed troops, their innocent enthusiasm touching his heart. Each conversation, each story, added another layer to Brad's growing understanding of the depth and complexity of service and sacrifice. He realized that these weren't just tales of the past, but living, breathing parts of the present that continued to shape the world around him. As the evening drew to a close, Brad found himself once again in the presence of Frank. The old veteran was sitting on a bench, looking out over the now quiet park. Brad approached hesitantly, still feeling the weight of his earlier behavior. "May I join you?" he asked softly. Frank looked up and nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Of course, son. Plenty of room." They sat in companionable silence for a few moments before Brad spoke. "I wanted to thank you, Frank, not just for your service, but for teaching me a valuable lesson today. I promise I'll do my best to honor and respect the sacrifices of those who served, whether in the military or as first responders." Frank turned to him, his eyes twinkling. "That's all we can ask for, Brad. To be remembered, to have our stories heard. It's not about glory or praise. It's about understanding where we've been, so we can better navigate where we're going." As they talked, Brad felt a sense of connection he had never experienced before. He realized that in dismissing the older generation, he had been cutting himself off from a wealth of wisdom and experience. Now, he saw the value in building bridges across generations, in learning from those who had come before. As the last light faded from the sky, Brad stood to leave, feeling profoundly changed by the day's events. He extended his hand to Frank one last time. "Thank you again, sir, for everything." Frank shook his hand warmly. "Remember, Brad, every day is an opportunity to learn, to grow, to be better. Don't waste it." Walking home under the starlit sky, Brad felt a newfound sense of purpose and humility. He vowed to carry the lessons of this day with him always, to approach others with respect and openness, regardless of their age or background. He understood now that true progress wasn't about dismissing the past, but about learning from it and building upon its foundations. As he reached his apartment, Brad paused and looked back in the direction of the park. He made a silent promise to himself and to all those he had misjudged, to be a better listener, a more compassionate friend, and a more engaged member of his community. The future, he realized, was not about leaving the past behind, but about honoring it and using its lessons to create a more understanding and respectful world. With this new perspective, Brad stepped into his home, ready to begin the next chapter of his life, one built on respect, empathy, and a deep appreciation for the quiet heroes who walk among us every day.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.